So my name is Father Paul Franks. I'm a priest here in St. Mary's. I'm from England originally, and I hope that I have retained my English accent. Last time I went home and had dinner with one of my friends. I hate to tell you, but the American accent is getting worse. I said, okay, I'm sorry. I was mortified. But I remember early on in my seminary, already my usages. So my usages are incurably American at this stage. And if I go back to England, who knows how much I will pay for it as far as ribbings and mockery. But already I was trying to stay true, stay true to my roots, stay true to my culture and my heritage. And I remember I was in a bookstore, over my first summer out of the seminary. And I wanted to go to get some philosophy books. They were on the second floor. So I went into the shop, went up to the second floor, and I looked everywhere, and I was looking all over the shop. I was like, am I losing my mind? I shouldn't see a philosophy section anywhere. And in the end, I went back to the clerk on the cash register, and I said, I'm really sorry. I know that philosophy is on the second floor, but I can't find it anywhere. Am I missing something? And she said, this is the first floor. And I said, oh, because as you probably know, as you may know, in England, the ground floor is what you call the first floor. We go in on the ground level, that's the ground floor. And then the floor above that is the first floor, which you would call the second floor. And then above that is the third floor, which you would call, I don't know what I'm talking about. You understand. So everything's off whack. And I had gone up, I was one floor below where I thought I should be, and I just realized I've been thinking in American. I didn't even know it, never thought about it, and that was a jolt. And that was just 1 year in. So by this stage, I don't know, I can't get it back. I'll have to be in England for 10 years before I can even think and speak like an English person again, if that. Anyway, so if you have difficulties understanding my accent, then I want you to know that you're in good company. I was once traveling with Father Wood and some of the other seminarians, now priests, amongst them Father McFarland, Father Carlyle Senior, many of you will know, Father James Carlyle, and others. And we were traveling in an undisclosed location in America, in a rural America, in a particular hollow. And we were meeting a family of traditional Catholics. First time we'd ever met them. And it was a large family. The youngest was at the time 5 years old, a 5-year-old little girl. And I'm not a great conversationalist with kids. I mean, I try, but it's not where I didn't grow up in a large family. I don't have lots of little, didn't have lots of little brothers and sisters running around. So it's not my forte. It doesn't come so naturally to me. And I was trying to make conversation with this little American girl. Hello, how are you? How old are you? She's like, what? I said, what's your name? She says, what? And it dawns on me, this poor girl, she doesn't know what I'm saying. Sometimes have the same suspicion in the confessional with the little ones. I just don't know what I'm saying. But I try to be clear. I try to be clear and slow. Anyway, it dawns on me she doesn't understand me. So I sort of look down. You can't understand me, can you? And she sort of, Father James Carlyle is there. She looks up at him. I can't understand him. So, she doesn't understand a word I'm saying. You don't understand a word I'm saying, do you? I don't understand a word he's saying. And then Father Carlyle comes in as my mediator and translator. He's like, no, it's just like, because he's English, so he has an accent, so you couldn't understand him because he has an accent. And she's like, what? You had an accident? Did you fall on your face? She looks up at Father Carlyle. Did he break his mouth? So she thought that I had broken my mouth. That's why she thought that I was incomprehensible to her. And we were trying to explain pleasantries, what is your name, and so on. And I had to say that my name was Paul, which is my first or Christian name. My name is Paul. And she couldn't understand me, so Father Carlyle had to translate again. His name is Paul, like, the pole on this light. And she's like, Paul? Paul. So that's how I became to be named and known, at least in that family, for posterity and for here on after. Why did I tell you that story? In fact, it has no relevance to what I'm going to talk about really at all, but all the other priests seem to be telling stories, and Father Rutledge told me that I had to tell you a story, and if I didn't tell you a story, then I shouldn't dare to show my face again in priestly company, and since that would be a great evil for me, belonging as I do to a society of common life, it's part of our life to see the priests, so I didn't want to go into this inability to function in the community, so that's why I told you that story, more or less under holy obedience. I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, what I want to talk about today is irrelevant to that, but I want to talk about the relationship of faith and reason. And something that interests me a lot, something that comes up in what I teach. Many of you will know that I teach, and I love it. I teach in St. Mary's College here. I teach in the academy as well. I have a catechism class in my parish that I teach as well. We're doing, in fact, more or less what Father Leith is doing planning to do, which is to go through the virtues. In our parish in Wichita, we're working through the same virtues, but we're a bit farther ahead of Father Leith. And I love teaching, and one of the classes I teach is called Apologetics. Apologetics is, in theology, it's what we call the science that defends the credibility of the Catholic religion. What does that mean? It's an organized body of knowledge which shows that the Catholic religion is reasonable to believe in and that it should be believed in. So it shows that it can be believed and it shows why it's reasonable to believe it. But it brings up this whole relationship of faith and reason. What Father Leith's going to talk about it when he talks about faith. But what are we doing when we make an act of faith? Are we shutting off our reason? Are we believing something unreasonable? All of these, is there something hostile between faith and reason? How do they stand in relation to each other? Is faith the enemy of science? Those sorts of things. Science the enemy of faith. And you do find that kind of rhetoric on both sides, amongst those who profess a religion and amongst those who profess no religion and adhere to, rationalism. You find that kind of idea, faith is the enemy of science. Science is the enemy of faith. So the Catholic conception is quite other. Basically, there are 3-4 big ways of conceiving the relationship between faith and reason. Either you say they're incompatible. They're incompatible, and that's not really a problem because only one of them is true. So either you say only reason has the truth and religion has nothing to offer and we don't need religion, which is what you call rationalism. You could have a rationalistic kind of deistic religion, but broadly speaking, we don't need revelation, we don't need mysteries, we don't need God to tell us anything, we don't need faith, we just have our reason. And there is no reality that could be known beyond the power of human reason. So you get, for example, a rationalistic atheist, like Professor Dawkins, like Christopher Hitchens, or you could get maybe a deist, who believes that on the basis of their human reasoning, by looking at the universe, they believe it must have a cause, but doesn't believe in miracles, doesn't believe in the possibility of God intervening, God revealing, certainly doesn't believe that Jesus Christ is God made man. So there's this first view that faith and reason are incompatible, but that doesn't matter, I choose reason. And I'm not interested in faith, there is nothing's given by faith. So you notice already there, I'm including the idea that it's possible to think that there is a God and still not to have the faith. That might surprise you, but for a Catholic, we'll talk about this in a moment, there is such a thing as a knowledge of God which just comes through reasoning alone. Aristotle believed that there was a God. Belief is not the right word. Aristotle thought that there was a God, and he did not have the faith. So he came to that conclusion just by philosophy, just by thinking. Yep. So you can know, you can think, you can know that there is a God without faith, strictly speaking. And then, on the other hand, you have something called fideism. So fideism says faith and reason are incompatible, and that's okay because I choose faith and I don't need reason. So that would be the kind of view that reason is broken in human beings. Reason is so warped and twisted and corrupted that it has nothing to offer, really. There's nothing even we can know for sure. And therefore, the only thing to do is to believe. And the only certain knowledge that we have is by believing. So we don't have certain knowledge really of anything in the natural world. Our reason is false and illusory, and the things that we think we know, we don't really know. So all we can do is to believe. That means if I want to know anything at all, the only way is that God reveals it to me. This would be the view, it's called fideism from faith. Fideism, but it's every time you have an ism, that means that that's the thing, that's the total explanation of everything, right? Fideism makes faith the total explanation. So there's no place for reason at all. Reason is suppressed, and all we have is faith. This would be the view of, for example, Martin Luther. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from Father Bomo's book, The 100 Years of Modernism. He talks about Martin Luther. So by his profession of skepticism in all areas of science, by his natural inclination to favour the will and to neglect reason, he proved himself a true child of his times. He stakes everything on faith without regard for common sense. In his faith, nothing has anything and no basis in anything rational. So faith is, in that view, a leap into the absurd, a flight into the unknown, full of distress, full of confidence from the depth of one's own being. This is to quote Jacques Maritain, quoted again in Father Bomo's book, speaking of Luther. Reason is directly opposed to faith. One ought to let it be. In believers, it should be killed and buried. She is the courtesan of the devil. It can only blaspheme and dishonor God, everything God has said or done. It's impossible to reform the church if scholastic theology and philosophy are not torn out by the roots with canon law. Get rid of St. Thomas, get rid of all of that Thomistic and scholastic tradition, philosophy and theology, tear it out by the roots. Logic is nowhere necessary in theology because Christ does not need human inventions. The Sorbonne, famous university in Paris, that mother of all errors, has defined as badly as could be that if a thing is true, it's true for theology and for philosophy. It's godless in it to have condemned those who hold the contrary. So in other words, faith and reason are not compatible, but it's okay. Reason is broken and cannot get us anything, and faith is what matters. And that's flows, in fact, from a very pessimistic view of human nature. This is a difference between the so-called Protestant reformers, a Luther, a Calvin, and Catholic theology. So for those thinkers, those first Protestant thinkers, Luther, Calvin, and so on, they believe in something called total depravity, which is to say, human reason is completely corrupted by original sin. Completely corrupted to the point that we can even say destroyed. So the reason, the will, these things cannot even reach their objects. The reason is so warped, so twisted, that it cannot even know the truth, even about common sense, basic natural things. It's blinded and it's darkened and it's powerless to even do the natural thing that God made it to do, to know natural truths. So that kind of very cynical and very pessimistic view of human nature means we don't know anything. And we haven't time to talk about the influence of nominalism on Luther and Augustinian theology and all of that. But coming from this kind of philosophical place which says we don't even know what things are. It's just a name. I say dog, dog, dog for 3 different dogs, but it's just a name. And there's nothing in them that makes them the same thing. They just kind of look the same. It's a convenient approximation. It helps me to get a handle on some kind of common basis for communication, but it doesn't correspond to anything real. These are 3 completely distinct things and not even of the same kind. So that's the kind of fideistic view. We don't need reason. And reason gets us nowhere. You just believe. And if reason contradicts faith, then I choose faith every time. Because reason has no rights to be listened to. Yep. So, then there's another solution. Those two, you see, they suppress the problem of faith and reason. There's no point trying to harmonize and delicately and see where they fit in with each other, because they don't fit in with each other. Either I get rid of faith or I get rid of reason. I suppress the problem. No problem. In the third solution says faith is true, reason is true, they can contradict, they're separate, and they're incompatible, but that's okay. I choose both. And if they contradict, I just live with the contradiction. So this is the sort of view of, first of all, we think about it, and you find that in 100 Years of Modernism of Father Bomo. You find that with the character Siger of Brabant, this 13th century thinker who found Aristotle, and was captivated. And he particularly found Aristotle. You remember that the West found Aristotle through the Muslim world. So he found Aristotle, which had its commentaries, and the commentaries were by these Muslim commentators who were kind of pantheists. So they were out there as regards philosophy, and probably wouldn't have been regarded as orthodox Muslims. They were these sorts of, God is the soul of the world and God is everything, and all human beings have one rational soul between them, so we're all one person, that kind of idea. And he finds Aristotle, and he finds it in these particular editions which have philosophical errors that are incompatible with the Catholic faith. And he thinks, this is it. I found it. This is the last word in natural wisdom. Aristotle used his human reason, and he got to the highest point that human reason can get, and he was on the money on every single question, and he got nothing wrong, and it's perfect. So he didn't, when it contradicted the faith, he's like, okay, Aristotle is perfectly true in the natural order, and the faith is perfectly true in the supernatural order, because they're just different orders. And where they contradict each other, that's okay. I absolutely believe everything Aristotle said, and when it contradicts the faith, I absolutely believe everything that the faith says as well, but not in the same way. That's a knowledge of reason. This is a knowledge of faith. That same kind of tendency is going to come back in history with, for example, a Kant, Immanuel Kant. So he writes these 2 books, The Critique of Pure Reason, The Critique of Practical Reason. And in the Critique of Pure Reason, he's going to say, we cannot know if there's a God. if you just look at it, a purely reasonable speculation, we don't know, really. We don't know if there's a God or not a God. And he's going to then go on to write another book called The Critique of Practical Reason, that says, but if there isn't a God, morality falls apart. So, although we don't really know if there's a God, nevertheless there is a God. There has to be a God. Because otherwise, there's nobody to guarantee that everybody's doing what they should be doing all the time. So it's kind of the same sort of idea. For reason, there can be no God, but for practical matters or for kind of moral matters, there must be a God. And again, of course, this thing comes back with modernism, the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, and to this day, which, what they say, the Christ of history is the real historical Christ, the man who lived and walked on this earth and said whatever he said. And then there's the Christ of faith, the Christ that we read about in the Gospels, who did all of these miracles and raised from the dead and founded a church and all of that sort of thing. And really, if you want to be a serious historian, then you have to look at what happened actually. So obviously we don't believe that people just, worked miracles and walked on water and rose from the dead and those sorts of things, because that's not the standards of true history. So what we need to do is go back, strip away all of those layers of myth and poetry and religious fervor that have kind of amplified the gospel stories, and find out what was the real historical fact. That idea. And so they can get up in the pulpit and be like, he is risen, alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. And then they can say on another page, of course, the resurrection is a reality of the faith, but it's not history. It's not like he stood up in his human body and walked around and ate fish and things. Okay, that kind of idea. There's a double truth, in other words. There's a double truth. So the Christ of history, I absolutely believe in him. The Christ of faith, I absolutely believe in him. But they're just different realities. One is true for faith, and one is true for history. And I live with the tension. And I'm happy to live with the tension, because this is a believer, and this is as an historian. So I don't let I don't let my role as a believer interrupt with my scholarly work. Fair enough? So those three views are wrong. Spoiler alert. The view that you have to get rid of the faith alone and you keep the reason alone. The view that you have to get rid of reason and you keep the faith alone. The view that you hold them both but they can contradict each other and that's okay because we just have to live with the contradiction. Those three views are all wrong. And the Catholic view is that faith and reason are distinct, but they're compatible. So in other words, they don't contradict each other. We have these two orders of reality, these two orders of knowledge. The order of reason, which, that's the order of common sense. It's the order of where I can use philosophy. It's the order of history. It's the order of the natural sciences. It's the order of what we call even natural theology. Sounds like a strange term. What does that mean? It means using my reason to look at reality and say, all of this must have a cause. It didn't come from nowhere. It didn't create itself. There must be a God. So even that's in the natural order, the order of reason. The order of reason. I can reason to certain truths that we often think about as being religious truths, but they're not strictly supernatural truths. There is a God. I have a soul. And when I die, my soul will not die. That I have the obligation to practice some worship of God if he made me and I depend on him. All of these things I can know just by reasoning about them. You don't need to be the faith. You don't need the faith. You don't need to be a Catholic. You could be an Aristotle. You could be a Muslim. You could be whatever. Just need to have a properly working reason and follow it. You could be a deist. You know. That's the order of reason. Then there's another order that God has given. The order of the supernatural order, which is the order of the faith. What is the faith? Believing what God has revealed. In other words, God intervenes in history and gives us certain knowledge that we could not have just by thinking about it on our own. For example, thinking about it on our own, you could come to the idea that, okay, look, there might be some being that is not God, but is above us because it doesn't have a body, but it still has an intellect and a will. There could be something that can think and that can love, but isn't God, but doesn't have a body. But it's not until God tells you, because how could you know that that thing existed? You can't ever see it, you can't put it in a lab, you can't sense it in any way because it doesn't have a body, doesn't have any matter. So how do you know if that thing exists or not? God has to tell you. And that's where what we call revelation. Beyond the order of things that we can just reason out on our own, he tells us there are angels. There is St. Michael, there is St. Gabriel, there is St. Raphael, you have a guardian angel. Those sorts of things. And even more, things like, what is God in himself? You know, this idea of the Blessed Trinity. God is three persons, consubstantial, co-eternal, one God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Not three gods, but one God. Oh, there's no way Aristotle's going to reason to that. It's impossible. There's nothing, there's no trace, there's no way that you can know that intimate secret about the inner life of God just by looking at creation. In fact, the reason is because God creates as one God. And therefore, everything that he does, the creation is the work of the one God. So even though you can make certain fittingnesses, you know, the person and the mind and the heart in man, but still it's not a proof that there's a Trinity. The only way that you know that there's a Trinity is God comes down from heaven or inspires somebody from heaven to tell you what he knows about himself. And those truths of the Trinity, the existence of angels, that Jesus Christ is true God and true man, they are something that we cannot ever just reason to on our own. We only know if God tells us. Nevertheless, that's the domain of revelation, the domain of faith, the domain of mysteries, the domain of the supernatural. So there's a natural over here with reason, there's the supernatural over there with faith. But notice what? Both of these are made by the same person, by the same God. The same three persons. The same God. So one God makes the order of reason, the natural universe, and also reveals the order of grace. Grace is over here, nature is over there. Faith is over here, reason is over there. Revelation is over here, philosophy is over there. And these truths, because they come from the one God, do not contradict each other. Faith is over here, science is over there. The natural universe and the order of grace have but one author, who is God, and he does not contradict himself. What does that mean? There is no contradiction between true science and the true religion. So they're compatible. And it's farther than that. It's like they can see the same things at a certain way. Remember, by reason we can know that there is a God. By reason we can know that I have an immortal soul. By reason we can know that I have to worship God. And with the faith you can see those same things, but you can see further. So it's like there are two lights that you shine down a big dark tunnel. One light has a pretty bright bulb, like 4,000 watts or something, and one light has a 40,000 watt bulb. The light of reason can see certain things down the tunnel. The light of faith can see the same things, but it can see much farther. So you can see there's no contradiction between the things you can see with the light of reason and the light of faith, but faith can see things that reason cannot. You can see farther down the tunnel with the light of faith. But there's no contradiction, because there's one God who made faith and reason, and God does not contradict himself, because it's against his wisdom. He's all-wise. Which is a great consolation for Catholics. It means that what we believe reasonably. And even the act of faith itself is a reasonable act. It's not a closing my eyes and diving into the absurd. There's no leap in that sense into I don't know what. There is a bridge between what we know by reason and what we know by faith. And I can cross it in a logical and steady order, So there are certain things that if you don't know them, then it makes no sense to make an act of faith in a certain way. So and that's when you're talking to somebody, you don't try and talk to somebody about the doctrine of the Trinity if they don't believe in God. It's work out where the person is and what you need to talk about to help that soul. So there are certain things that have to be settled first. Can we know any reality whatsoever? Is there a God? Do I have a soul? If there's a God, and I've conceded that there's a God, do I have any obligations to worship him? Or can he do his thing and I do my thing and we're all fine? Those are what the church calls the preambles of faith. The preambles, like they're the walkway that gets you to the faith. They're the kind of prelude. And those things can be known and argued by just using pure reason. You don't have to be a Catholic to know those things. You can talk to anybody without saying God has revealed, without saying Jesus Christ tells us, without saying the Catholic Church teaches, just making reasonable arguments. Those things are called the preambles of the faith. And then the other reasonable basis for making an act of faith is what we call the motives of credibility. Those are the things that make the Catholic faith worthy of belief. So, what does it mean for a religion to be worthy of belief? First of all, that it is consistent with reason. It doesn't contradict reason. Because if it contradicts what is certain by reason, by philosophy, then it cannot be true. God does not contradict himself. So it doesn't contain anything that's contradicting to reason. It doesn't contain anything that is contradictory to the natural law. For example, a religion which says God has a body and was made by another God, like the Mormon religion, it contradicts natural reason. Like, there's no possibility that it could be the right religion if you understand philosophy. Or that says that it's okay to lie. You can lie all you want, provided that you are doing it for good reason. You cannot, that contradicts the natural law. So any religion that contradicts what is naturally knowable, what is reasonable, what is moral, cannot come from God. And then, does it contradict itself on every page? Because that's not reasonable either. If a religion contradicts itself on every page, then we have problems. Certainly, there is sometimes careful work of scholars to show the harmonization between different accounts in the Gospels and so on, but that's a very different thing to a flat-out contradiction. Even though if looked at superficially, you could conclude, but that's why we don't look at things superficially. And then lastly, does it have the kind of sublimity that you'd expect for something coming from God? All of those things are an indication that the religion might be from God. if it contradicts reason, if it contradicts a natural law, if it contradicts itself, then it's certain that it's not from God. But how do you really know if something is from God? It has to have something in it that is beyond human powers. Something that's beyond the power of human reason. There has to be some sign from God that this message is from God. And that means we're looking for something beyond purely natural order, beyond purely natural causes. So what does that mean in concrete? It means a miracle. A miracle, which means either something beyond the laws of nature, or it means something that is a miraculous knowledge, knowing something that you couldn't possibly know by human powers, which is what we call a prophecy. You know something that only God can know because he's outside of time. And it's not a guess, and it's not so vague that you could have just made it up, and it's not something that can be known by the agency of demons and so on. And really, those are the rational bases for an act of faith. So you look at, is there some sign that this comes from God? Because God wouldn't hold us to account to believe something with the penalty of, losing our salvation if we refuse to believe it, unless he gave us a very, very clear sign that it was from him. And those signs are looking at miracles, looking at prophecies, particularly. Those are what we call the motives of credibility. They show us not only that the religion is possible to come from God, but they show us clearly that it is from God. It has digitus Dei hic est. The finger of God is here. And so all of that is something very reasonable. We look at our philosophy and we get the preambles of faith, and we can talk about all those things individually. And we look at history, we look at what really happened, and we judge, this is the mark that God is here. So all of that means that our way to make the act of faith is paved by reason, every step of the way. It's true that once I've seen, yes, there is a God, yes, I have a soul, yes, there's a natural religion, yes, Jesus Christ existed, yes, he worked miracles, yes, he claimed to be God, yes, his miracles prove he is God, yes, he founded a visible church, yes, that church is the Catholic Church with the Pope at its head. Once I see all of that, I get to the point, okay, it's reasonable for me to make an act of faith. Still, that doesn't force me to believe. That's just a judgment. It would be reasonable if I believed. Then I have to get a grace, because it's a supernatural thing. God gives me a grace, and I choose to believe. And then my will tells my intellect, so believe already. And then I believe. That's the act of faith. I'm believing under the impulse of a supernatural grace, believing everything that God has revealed because God revealed it, which I'm reasonably certain of because I've seen the preambles of the faith and the motives of credibility. That is making an act of faith, something in the intellect. So even then, the work of reason isn't done. Now I have the faith. And I've already established that there is philosophy and there's faith. And because they're both from one God and because they don't contradict, they can even be, in a certain sense, married to each other. And that's what we mean by theology, sacred theology, taking what is certain by reason and taking what is certain by faith and combining them into one edifice, one body of knowledge. And that's something that's certain for a Catholic. Catholic theology is certain, at least when it's talking about the central things. Why? Because the knowledge of reason is certain, and the knowledge of faith is certain. We know for a fact that it's reasonable to believe everything that God has revealed. We know for a fact that it's reasonable to believe what the Catholic Church teaches because it's founded by Christ, who claimed to be God, proved his claims by miracles. So the knowledge of reason is certain because our mind can know reality. That's a whole nother discussion. The knowledge of faith is certain because revelation certainly took place beyond a shadow of a doubt. beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt. Okay, so we make this great synthesis, which is reason and faith together, making theology. And that means that we can think about the things that God has revealed, we can defend them against people who attack them, we can show that they're not absurd, we can defend the faith by apologetics, we can even find new truths that are sort of contained in what God has told us by thinking about them, which is what we call dogmatic theology. And we can certainly see the connections between that and all different parts of the faith. We can find good examples to explain the faith from human reasoning, from human analogies. So, for example, Christ is the head of the church, and the church is the body. Okay, Our Lady is the neck. So we help to explain Our Lady's mediation of all graces just by analogy, by comparison, by metaphor, to something that's commonplace and known to us. So already, it's not like we make an act of faith and then it's okay, I switch my reason off. My reason is fully engaged in getting me to the act of faith, and my reason is fully engaged in studying my faith, in defending my faith, in thinking about it, and in the work of theology. So at no point is the reason abdicated, is the reason shut off. It's not unreasonable to be a Catholic. It's supremely reasonable to be a Catholic. You think of a Chesterton. In fact, I want to end with a little conclusion from Chesterton. It's the very end of his book on St. Thomas Aquinas. Because for Catholics, the high point, in a certain sense, of this theological project, which was the marriage of reason and faith, is found in St. Thomas, who became the ordinary doctor of the Catholic Church. He was both a philosopher and obviously a believer, but then a theologian. And he made this beautiful monument, the Summa Theologica, which is the high point in many ways of Catholic theology, still referred to as a source and mainstay of traditional Catholic theology today. And he's talking about, this is the very end of Chesterton's book about St. Thomas. He talks about Luther. He destroyed reason. Speaking of Luther, he destroyed reason and substituted suggestion. It's said that the great reformer publicly burned the Summa Theologica and the works of Aquinas. And with the bonfire of such books, this book may well come to an end. He's talking about his own book about Aquinas. They say it's very difficult to burn a book, and it must have been extremely difficult to burn such a mountain of books as the Dominican had contributed to the controversies of Christendom. Anyhow, there is something lurid and apocalyptic about the idea of such destruction when we consider the compact complexity of all that encyclopedic survey of social and moral and theoretical things, all the close-packed definitions that excluded so many errors and extremes, all the broad and balanced judgments upon the clash of loyalties or the choice of evils, all the liberal speculations upon the limits of government or the proper conditions of justice, all the distinctions between the use and abuse of private property, all the rules and exceptions about the great evil of war, all the allowances for human weakness and all the provisions for human health, all this mass of medieval humanism shriveled and curled up in smoke before the eyes of its enemy. And that great passionate peasant rejoiced darkly, because the day of the intellect was over. Sentence by sentence it burned, and syllogism by syllogism. And the golden maxims turned to golden flames in that last and dying glory of all that had once been the great wisdom of the Greeks. The great central synthesis of history that was to have linked the ancient with the modern world went up in smoke for half the world and was forgotten like a vapour. For a time it seemed that destruction was final. It is still expressed in the amazing fact that in the North, modern men can still write histories of philosophy in which philosophy stops with the last little sophists of Greece and Rome and is never heard of again until the appearance of such a third-rate philosopher as Francis Bacon. And yet this small book, which will probably do nothing else, or have very little other value, will at least be a testimony to the fact that the tide has turned once more. It is 400 years after, and this book, I hope, and I'm happy to say I believe, will probably be lost and forgotten in the flood of better books about St. Thomas Aquinas, which are at this moment pouring from every printing press in Europe, and even in England and America. Compared with such books, it's obviously a very slight and amateurish production, but it is not likely to be burned, and if it were, it would not leave even a noticeable gap in the pouring mass of new and magnificent work, which is now daily dedicated to the Philosophia Perennis, to the everlasting philosophy. And Deo gratias, that's the case. We have seen the reflourishing of the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, certainly dented significantly by Vatican II, but still a surging stream, still taught in our dear St. Mary's College here by myself and Father Torzala, and still received appreciatively by young and fervent minds. And it's something I think as Catholics we have to be so insistent upon. The human mind is made for truth, and the desire for the truth is never extinguished in the human mind. Doesn't matter what depths of depravity somebody is sunk in, at the bottom of it all, they still want the truth. There is that desire for truth. Maybe they're in complete denial about it themselves. Maybe it's buried. Maybe they've twisted their conscience. But we have to just keep willing to give the truth and trust that the truth is powerful, and that even the truths of philosophy, the natural truths, God can use them to touch souls and to put souls on the right course and to get them towards the truth, to get them towards a true religion.